Leah Morgan thought her days of discovering life-changing secrets were behind her, but when her loyal German shepherd Max started barking frantically at something floating in the Clearwater River, she had no idea she was about to uncover a mystery that would drag her back into the darkest chapter of her military service. Inside that waterlogged wooden crate was a silent little girl, barely breathing, clutching a crumpled note that read simply, "Tell her dad I waited." What Leah didn't know was that this child held the key to a mission her unit had buried 10 years ago, a mission that cost lives and shattered families, and now someone wanted the truth to surface. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning mist clung to the Clearwater River like ghostly fingers as Leah Morgan adjusted her worn hiking boots on the muddy bank. Her German shepherd, Max, bounded ahead with the enthusiasm of a dog half his 7 years, his black and tan coat gleaming with dewdrops. The familiar weight of her military dog tags beneath her flannel shirt served as a constant reminder of the life she'd left behind. 3 years ago, when an IED blast in Afghanistan had sent shrapnel through her left leg and fragments of doubt through her soul. "Easy there, boy," she called softly, watching Max's ears perk up at the sound of her voice. The morning ritual of their riverside walk had become sacred to both of them, a quiet meditation that helped keep the nightmares at bay and the phantom pain in her damaged leg manageable. The VA doctors had recommended a service dog for her PTSD, but Max had become so much more than that. He was her anchor to the present, when memories of blood-soaked sand and the screams of wounded soldiers threatened to pull her under. The river ran swift and clear this morning, swollen from the recent spring rains that had battered their small Oregon town for the better part of a week. Leah breathed in the crisp air, letting the earthy scent of wet pine and river stones fill her lungs. She'd moved to Millbrook specifically for mornings like this, far from the chaos of military bases and the constant reminder of friends who hadn't made it home. Here, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and the gentle symphony of flowing water, she could almost forget the weight of the Purple Heart gathering dust in her bedroom drawer. Max suddenly froze mid-stride, his body going rigid as his nose lifted to catch a scent carried on the morning breeze. His hackles rose slowly, a low whine escaping his throat as he stared intently at something downstream. Leah followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual, just the river's gentle current carrying the occasional branch or cluster of leaves toward the old railroad bridge that spanned the water about a quarter-mile ahead. "What is it, Max?" she asked, limping slightly as she moved closer to her canine companion. The German shepherd had been trained for bomb detection during his 4 years of military service before retiring alongside Leah, and she'd learned to trust his instincts implicitly. His ears swiveled forward like radar dishes, tracking something she couldn't yet perceive. Then she saw it, a dark shape bobbing in the water about 50 yards downstream, too large to be debris and too deliberate in its movement to be natural. As it drifted closer, carried by the current, Leah could make out the rough edges of what appeared to be a wooden crate, waterlogged and listing to one side as it navigated the gentle rapids. Max began barking, sharp and insistent, the kind of alert bark that had once meant the difference between life and death in the mountains of Afghanistan. He paced along the riverbank, never taking his eyes off the approaching object, his tail stiff and his body coiled with tension. "I see it, boy," Leah murmured, her own instincts beginning to sharpen as years of military training kicked in. There was something wrong about the way the crate moved in the water, too controlled, as if it contained something that was shifting its weight. She reached for the cell phone in her jacket pocket, then hesitated. What would she tell the authorities? That her dog was barking at floating debris? That her gut was telling her this was important? The crate bumped against a fallen log about 30 feet from shore, spinning slowly in the eddy created by the obstruction. From this distance, Leah could see that it was roughly the size of a large shipping container, made of what looked like rough pine planks held together with rusted metal bands. Dark stains streaked down its sides, and she couldn't tell if they were from river water or something else entirely. Max's barking intensified, and he began pacing in tight circles, occasionally looking back at Leah as if urging her to take action. She'd seen this behavior before, in Afghanistan, when Max had detected explosives or hidden dangers that human senses couldn't perceive. Her heart rate began to climb. that familiar mixture of adrenaline and dread that had once been a daily companion in combat zones. Without fully conscious thought, Lee began stripping off her jacket and boots. The water would be freezing, fed by mountain snowmelt and spring runoff. But something deep in her bones told her that waiting for help wasn't an option. Max whined and pressed against her legs as she rolled up her jeans, his way of expressing concern for her safety. "Stay, Max. Stay and watch," she commanded, using the firm tone that had once directed him through minefields and hostile territory. The dog reluctantly sat but remained alert, his dark eyes never leaving the crate as Lee waded into the shockingly cold water. The current was stronger than she'd anticipated, and her injured leg protested as she fought to maintain her footing on the slippery river stones. Each step sent needles of cold pain shooting up through her bones, but she pressed forward, drawn by an urgency she couldn't quite name. The crate bobbed gently in the eddy, and as she got closer, she could hear something that made her blood run cold. Scratching. Faint, but unmistakable, coming from inside the wooden container. "Oh God," she whispered, her breath forming white puffs in the cold morning air. Her military medic training kicked into overdrive as she reached the fallen log and used it for support while examining the crate more closely. The metal bands that held it together were secured with a simple latch mechanism, not locked, but designed to keep the lid firmly in place. The scratching came again, weaker this time, accompanied by what sounded like a soft whimper. Lee's hands shook as she worked to free the latch, her fingers numb from the cold water, but driven by the desperate knowledge that whatever was inside was running out of time. "Hold on," she called softly, not knowing if whatever was trapped could hear her, but needing to offer some reassurance. "I'm going to get you out." The latch finally gave way with a rusty squeal of protest, and Lee carefully lifted the heavy wooden lid. What she saw inside nearly sent her tumbling backward into the deeper water. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, lay curled in the bottom of the crate like a broken doll. Her dark hair was matted with river water, and her lips had taken on a blue tinge that Lee recognized as the early stages of hypothermia. The child's clothes, a simple yellow dress that might once have been bright and cheerful, clung to her small frame like a sodden shroud. But it was the girl's eyes that stopped Leah's heart. They were open, staring up at the gray morning sky with an expression of such profound resignation that it seemed impossible for someone so young. When the child turned those dark eyes to meet Leah's gaze, there was no surprise, no relief, no emotion at all. Just a terrible, ancient sadness that belonged in the face of someone who had seen far too much of the world's cruelty. "Sweetheart," Leah breathed, her medic training overriding the shock as she quickly assessed the situation. "I'm going to lift you out, okay? You're safe now." The girl didn't respond, didn't even blink, but she didn't resist as Lee carefully lifted her from the crate. She was shockingly light, as if she were made of hollow bones and shadow, and her skin was dangerously cold to the touch. Hypothermia was setting in fast, and Lee knew they had precious little time before the child's condition became critical. As she lifted the girl, something crinkled beneath her small body. A piece of paper, folded and somehow still relatively dry despite the moisture in the crate. Leah grabbed it with one hand while cradling the child with the other, then began the treacherous journey back to shore. Max was waiting at the water's edge, whining with concern as Lee emerged from the river with her precious cargo. The child remained utterly silent, not even shivering despite the fact that her core temperature was clearly dropping. In Lee's experience, that was a bad sign, very bad. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, wrapping the girl in her discarded jacket before fumbling for her cell phone. "I'm going to call for help, and everything's going to be fine." But as she dialed 911, her eyes fell on the piece of paper she'd retrieved from the crate. With growing dread, she unfolded it with one hand while keeping the other around the silent child. The message was written in careful block letters, as if by someone who had taken great care to make every word legible. "Tell her dad I waited. Tell him Sarah kept her promise. Tell him the medic will remember." Lee's phone slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering on the rocky shore as the blood drained from her face. Sarah. That name hit her like a physical blow, dragging her back 10 years to a dusty compound in Afghanistan, to a mission that had gone horribly wrong, to promises made in blood and desperation that she'd spent years trying to forget. The little girl in her arms turned those dark, knowing eyes up to meet hers, and for the first time since Leah had pulled her from the water, the child spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from cold and something deeper, but every word was crystal clear. "Mama said you would come," the girl said. "Mama said the lady with the kind eyes would find me when it was time." Lee's world tilted on its axis as recognition slammed into her with the force of a freight train. Those eyes, those impossibly familiar dark eyes, belonged to someone she had last seen bleeding out in a bombed-out building half a world away. Someone who had died in her arms, while begging Leah to deliver a message she had never been able to give. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Leah managed to ask through a throat that felt like it was closing. "Emma," the child replied, and then, with a matter-of-factness that chilled Lee to her bones, she added, "Emma Rodriguez. My mama was Sarah Rodriguez. She said you would remember her." The world went silent except for the sound of Lee's own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Sarah Rodriguez, the young Army translator who had been assigned to Lee's unit during their final deployment. Sarah, who had been barely 22 years old when she stepped on that IED while trying to evacuate civilians from a compromised building. Sarah, who had whispered her last words to Lee with blood frothing on her lips. "Tell my daughter I waited. Tell Emma her mama kept her promise." But Sarah had been single. Everyone knew that. She'd never mentioned having a child, never showed pictures or talked about family back home. How could this girl be her daughter? Lee's hands shook as she retrieved her phone from the rocks, her fingers barely functional as she redialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, she could barely form coherent words. "I need an ambulance at Clearwater River, mile marker 7, she managed. "I have a child, approximately 6 years old, severe hypothermia, unresponsive. Please hurry." While they waited for the paramedics, Leah held Emma close, trying to warm the child with her own body heat, while her mind reeled with questions. Max pressed against them both, adding his warmth to the pile, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand the gravity of the situation. "Emma," Lee said softly, "how did you end up in that box in the river?" The girl's eyes remained fixed on something in the distance, her voice still that same eerily calm whisper. "The bad man said I had to wait in the box. He said when the river took me to the right place, someone would find me and remember Mama. He said it was time to tell the truth." "What bad man, honey? What truth? What truth?" But Emma had gone silent again, her small body finally beginning to shiver as the shock wore off and hypothermia set in properly. Leah held her tighter, whispering reassurances, while her own mind raced with implications she wasn't ready to face. The wail of sirens in the distance brought her back to the immediate crisis. The paramedics would take Emma to the hospital, where she would be safe and warm. And then the questions would begin. Questions Lee wasn't sure she was ready to answer, about a mission that had been classified, about promises she had never been able to keep, about a young woman whose death had haunted her dreams for 10 years. But as she looked down at Emma's pale face, so much like her mother's that it took Leah's breath away, she knew there was no running from this. Sarah Rodriguez had somehow sent her daughter to find the one person who could tell her father that she had kept her promise, whatever that promise had been. The problem was, Lee had no idea who Emma's father was, or why Sarah had kept his existence a secret from everyone in their unit. All she knew was that this little girl had been deliberately placed in her path, and that someone out there wanted the truth about that final mission to finally come to light. The ambulance rounded the bend in the river road, red and blue lights cutting through the morning mist, and Lee steeled herself for what she knew would be the beginning of a journey back into the darkest chapter of her life. As the paramedics took Emma from her arms, the child's fingers caught at Leah's dog tags, pulling them free from beneath her shirt. "She wore these too," Emma whispered, her words barely audible over the sound of medical equipment being prepared. "Mama wore the same metal tags. She said they meant she was a soldier like her dad." Leah's heart stopped. Sarah had never served in the military. She had been a civilian contractor, a translator hired for her language skills, not a soldier. So why would she have been wearing dog tags? Unless they were hers and all. As the ambulance pulled away with Emma safely inside, Leah remained standing on the riverbank with Max at her side, staring at the empty wooden crate that bobbed gently in the eddy. The implications of what she'd just heard were staggering, threatening to unravel everything she thought she knew about that final mission and the woman who had died in her arms. If Sarah had been wearing someone else's dog tags, someone who was Emma's father, then that someone was likely a soldier who had served with them. Someone who had never known he had a daughter. Someone who was still out there, living his life without knowing that Sarah Rodriguez had carried his child and his secret to her grave. Lee pulled out her phone again, this time scrolling through contacts she hadn't called in years. If she was going to help Emma find her father and deliver Sarah's long-overdue message, she would need to reach out to people she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. She would need to dig into classified files and buried memories to reconstruct the final days of a deployment that had ended in tragedy and unanswered questions. But first, she needed to know more about the man who had put Emma in that crate. The man who had apparently known about Sarah's secret and had used it to deliver a message that could only be understood by someone who had been there that terrible day in Afghanistan. Max whined softly and pressed against her legs, sensing her distress. Lee reached down to stroke his ears, grateful for his steady presence as her world shifted around her. "Come on, boy," she said finally, her voice stronger than she felt. "We have work to do." The hospital in Millbrook was small but efficient, and Emma was quickly admitted to the pediatric ward for observation and treatment. Lee sat in the waiting room, still wearing her damp clothes, watching through the glass doors as nurses and doctors bustled around the small girl who lay so still in the hospital bed. Dr. Patricia Wells, the attending physician, emerged from Emma's room after what felt like hours, but had probably been less than one. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense manner of someone who had seen her share of medical emergencies. "She's stable," Dr. Wells reported, settling into the chair beside Leah. "Her core temperature is back to normal, and there's no sign of permanent damage from the hypothermia. Physically, she's remarkably healthy for a child who just survived being trapped in a wooden crate in a river. But, Lee prompted, recognizing the careful tone of a medical professional preparing to deliver complicated news. "But she's not speaking to anyone else," Dr. Wells continued. "She answered basic questions about her name and age. But when I asked about her family or how she ended up in the river, she just stared at the ceiling. She's asked for you several times, though. She seems to trust you." Lee nodded, not surprised. Emma had been through an unimaginable trauma, and Lee was the only familiar face in a world that had probably felt hostile and frightening for longer than any child should have to endure. "There's something else," Dr. Wells added, her voice dropping lower. "I've been required to report this to Child Protective Services, and they'll want to interview both you and Emma. They're also contacting the FBI, given the unusual circumstances of how she was found." The FBI. Lee felt a chill that had nothing to do with her still damp clothes. Federal involvement meant questions, investigations, and scrutiny that could expose classified information about Sarah's death and the mission that had killed her. Information that Lee wasn't sure she was legally allowed to share, even to save a child. "Can I see her?" Lee asked. Dr. Wells nodded. "She's been asking for you. Maybe you can get her to talk about what happened." Emma's room was painted in cheerful pastels that seemed almost obscenely bright compared to the darkness of what the child had endured. She lay in the hospital bed looking impossibly small. Her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. When Lee entered, Emma's eyes immediately focused on her with an intensity that was unsettling in someone so young. "You came back," Emma said simply, as if there had never been any doubt. "Of course I did," Lee replied, pulling a chair close to the bed. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Better. The doctor lady gave me warm soup." Emma paused, studying Leah's face with those knowing eyes. "You look like her. Like Mama." Around the eyes. Lee felt her heart clench. "Emma, I need you to tell me what happened. How did you end up in that crate?" For a long moment, Emma was silent, her gaze drifting to the window, where afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass. When she spoke again, her voice held the careful cadence of someone reciting a well-rehearsed story. "The man with the scars came to see me at my grandmother's house," she began. He said it was time to deliver Mama's message. He said Mama had asked him to wait until I was old enough to understand, but that something bad was going to happen, and he couldn't wait anymore. What kind of scars? Lee asked gently. Emma touched her left cheek. Here. Like someone had drawn lines with a crayon, but deeper. He said Mama saved his life once, and he owed her a promise. Lee's blood ran cold. She knew those scars, had seen them up close in the aftermath of the same IED blast that had killed Sarah. Corporal Marcus Webb, their unit's explosives specialist, had been thrown clear of the blast, but not before shrapnel had carved 3 parallel lines down his left cheek. He'd survived, medically discharged with a Purple Heart and a traumatic brain injury that had left him struggling with memory and impulse control. If Marcus Webb had taken Emma, if he was the one who had put her in that crate, then he was operating on some twisted logic born of PTSD and guilt. But he was also the only other person who had been there when Sarah died, who had heard her final words and understood their significance. Emma, Lee said carefully, did this man tell you why he put you in the box? The girl nodded solemnly. He said the river would take me to the lady with the kind eyes. He said the river knew where to find Mama's friend, the one who tried to save her. He said you would know what to do with Mama's message. And what is your Mama's message? Emma's eyes filled with tears for the first time since Leah had found her, but her voice remained steady. Mama said to tell my daddy that she waited for him to come home. She said to tell him that she kept her promise, and that Emma loves him even though she never met him. She said the medic would remember, and would know how to find him. The weight of responsibility settled on Leah's shoulders like a physical burden. Sarah Rodriguez had somehow orchestrated this entire situation, using a damaged veteran to deliver her daughter to the one person who might be able to reunite the child with a father who probably didn't even know she existed. But how had Sarah known that Lee would be walking by the Burren River that morning? How had she known that Lee had survived the war and settled in this small Oregon town? And most importantly, how had she known that Emma would survive being placed in a crate and sent down a dangerous river? The answer, when it came to Leah, was as chilling as it was obvious. Sarah hadn't known any of those things. Marcus Webb had been watching Leah, tracking her movements, waiting for the right moment to carry out what he believed were his orders from a dead woman. His damaged mind had constructed an elaborate plan based on fragments of memory and misplaced loyalty, and by some miracle, it had actually worked. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Wells entered, followed by a woman in a business suit who radiated the unmistakable aura of federal authority. Ms. Morgan, Dr. Wells said, this is Special Agent Jennifer Castillo with the FBI. She'd like to speak with you about Emma's situation. Agent Castillo was in her 30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of controlled demeanor that suggested she'd seen her share of unusual cases. She looked at Emma with professional compassion before turning her attention to Leah. Ms. Morgan, I understand you served in Afghanistan with the 47th Medical Battalion, Agent Castillo said, consulting a tablet in her hands. I'm hoping you can help us understand how this child ended up in your path this morning. Lee felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with discussing her military service. I'm not sure what you mean. We've run Emma's fingerprints through our system, Agent Castillo continued. She's been missing from her grandmother's home in Portland for 3 days. Her grandmother, Maria Santos, filed a missing person report after Emma disappeared from their backyard. According to Mrs. Santos, a man matching the description of Marcus Webb was seen in the neighborhood asking questions about Emma. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Marcus had been planning this for months, maybe years. He'd located Sarah's family, discovered Emma's existence, and formulated his plan to reunite the child with her unknown father. But something had forced his hand, made him act before he was ready. Agent Castillo, Lee said carefully, I think you need to understand that this situation is more complicated than it appears. Emma's mother died in Afghanistan 10 years ago, and I believe someone has been trying to deliver a message from beyond the grave. The agent's eyebrows rose slightly. That's quite a claim, Ms. Morgan. Perhaps you could start from the beginning. Over the next hour, Lee told Agent Castillo everything she could remember about Sarah Rodriguez and the mission that had ended in tragedy. She described the IED blast, Sarah's final moments, and the message she had been unable to deliver. She explained about Marcus Webb's injuries and his history of PTSD-related episodes that had landed him in and out of VA hospitals for years. What she didn't mention was the classified nature of their mission or the specific details about why they had been in that particular building when the bomb went off. Those details were locked away in files that would require security clearances and congressional approval to be accessed. So you believe Corporal Webb kidnapped this child in order to fulfill what he perceived as a dying woman's last wish? Agent Castillo asked. That's my assessment, Lee replied. Marcus isn't evil. He's damaged. He's been carrying guilt about Sarah's death for 10 years, and his mind has probably convinced him that this was the only way to honor her memory. Agent Castillo made notes on her tablet, occasionally glancing at Emma, who had been listening to the entire conversation with the eerily mature attention of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. We'll need to bring Webb in for questioning, the agent said finally. Do you have any idea where he might be? Leah shook her head. I haven't seen Marcus since our discharge 3 years ago. But Emma, honey, did the man with the scars say anything about where he was going after he put you in the river? Emma considered the question with the seriousness of someone much older. He said he had to go home now. He said Mama would be waiting for him there, and they could finally rest. The implication hit Lee like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't planning to run from the consequences of his actions. He was planning to end his own life, believing that his mission was complete and that he could finally join Sarah in whatever peace awaited them. Agent Castillo, we need to find him now, Lee said urgently. I think he's going to hurt himself. The agent was already reaching for her phone. What's his last known address? I don't know, but the VA will have records. He's been in and out of their system for years. As Agent Castillo stepped out of the room to make calls, Emma reached out and took Leah's hand. Her small fingers were warm now, a remarkable improvement from the ice-cold touch of that morning. Will you help me find my daddy? Emma asked quietly. Leah squeezed the girl's hand gently. Yes, sweetheart. I promise. I'll help you find him. But even as she made the promise, Leah wondered if she would be able to keep it. Finding Emma's father would mean diving deep into classified records and buried secrets, reaching out to former comrades who might not want to remember their time in Afghanistan, and confronting her own demons about the mission that had haunted her dreams for a decade. Still, looking into Emma's trusting eyes, so much like her mother's, Leah knew she had no choice. Sarah Rodriguez had died believing that someone would tell her daughter's father that she had kept her promise. It was time for Leah to finally deliver that message, no matter what the cost. The first step was finding Marcus Webb before he did something irreversible. The second step would be identifying Emma's father from among the dozens of soldiers who had served in their unit, and the Barai. Third step, the one that terrified Lee most of all, would be explaining to Emma's father why he had never known he had a daughter. Agent Castillo returned to the room, her expression grim. We found Webb. He's barricaded himself in a motel room in Portland, and he's not responding to negotiators. The local SWAT team is on standby, but they're hoping you might be able to talk to him. Lee's stomach dropped. You want me to talk him down? You knew him. You served with him. Right now, you might be the only person who can reach him before the situation escalates. Lee looked at Emma, who was watching the conversation with those two knowing eyes. The child had already lost her mother to war and violence. She couldn't lose the man who had tried, in his broken way, to honor her mother's final wish. I'll do it, Lee said. But I want to bring Emma's grandmother into this. Emma needs family right now. People who knew her mother. Agent Castillo nodded. I'll make the arrangements. We'll transport you to Portland within the hour. As the adults made their plans, Emma tugged on Leah's sleeve. When Leah leaned down, the girl whispered something that sent chills down her spine. The man with the scars showed me pictures of Mama when she was young. She was wearing the metal tags like yours, but they had a different name on them. A name that starts with J. Lee's heart raced. If Sarah had been wearing someone else's dog tags, if those tags belonged to Emma's father, then the name beginning with J was their first real clue to his identity. But dog tags were personal items, not easily given away. For Sarah to have been wearing them, the relationship with Emma's father must have been Serious. Possibly even a secret marriage. Do you remember what the full name was, Emma? The girl closed her eyes, concentrating. It was long, like Jackson something. Jackson, with more letters after it. Lee's mind raced through the roster of their unit, searching for anyone named Jackson. There had been a Sergeant Jackson Reeves in their company. A medic like herself, who had been known for his gentle manner with wounded soldiers. He had been quiet, professional, and had never mentioned having a girlfriend back home. But if Jackson Reeves was Emma's father, where was he grade? Now? Why hadn't he come forward when news of Sarah's death reached the States? Had he even known about their relationship, or had Sarah kept it secret for reasons of her own? The questions multiplied exponentially, as Lee realized that this mystery was far more complex than a simple case of a message from a dying woman. This was about hidden relationships, secret pregnancies, and the ripple effects of decisions made in the heat of war. At first, she had to save Marcus Webb from himself. And then, somehow, she would have to find Jackson Reeves and tell him that he had a daughter who desperately needed to know her father. The drive to Portland took 2 hours, during which Lee sat in the back of Agent Castillo's unmarked car, staring out at the Oregon landscape and trying to prepare herself for what lay ahead. Emma had been placed in the temporary custody of her grandmother, Maria Santos, a dignified woman in her 60s who had held her granddaughter close while tears of relief streamed down her weathered cheeks. Mrs. Santos had confirmed Emma's story about the man with the scars, adding details that painted a picture of Marcus Webb as a deeply troubled individual who had been watching the family for months. He had approached her several times, asking about Sarah and Emma, claiming that he had served with Sarah and owed her a debt. Mrs. Santos had been frightened by his intensity, but hadn't thought to call the police until Emma disappeared. He kept saying Sarah was waiting. Mrs. Santos had told Agent Castillo. He said she couldn't rest until her message was delivered. He seemed to believe she was still alive somewhere, waiting for him to complete his mission. Now, as they approached the motel where Marcus had barricaded himself, Lee tried to summon the calm authority she had once used to talk wounded soldiers through medical procedures in the field. Marcus wasn't the enemy. He was a casualty of war, a man whose mind had been shattered by trauma and guilt, and who had been trying, in the only way he knew how, to honor the memory of a fallen comrade. The Riverside Motel was a typical highway establishment. 2 stories of faded paint and broken dreams lined up along a busy street. Police cars surrounded the building, their red and blue lights painting the afternoon in urgent colors. A SWAT truck was parked discreetly behind the main building, and Lee could see tactical officers positioned at strategic points around Marcus's room on the 2nd floor. Agent Castillo led Lee to a command post that had been set up in the motel office, where she was introduced to Detective Ray Morrison, the Portland police negotiator who had been trying unsuccessfully to establish communication with Marcus for the past 2 hours. He's got the door barricaded and won't respond to our calls, Detective Morrison explained. We can hear him moving around in there, talking to someone, but there's no one else in the room. We think he's having a conversation with voices in his head. Lee's heart ached for her former comrade. Marcus had been a good soldier, professional and dependable, but the brain injury from the IED blast had left him vulnerable to the kind of psychological breakdown that could turn dangerous without warning. "Let me try," she said, accepting the phone that would connect her to the landline in Marcus's room. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered, though it sounded strained and hollow compared to the man she remembered. "Marcus," she said gently, "it's Leah Morgan. From Afghanistan. From the 47th Medical." There was a long silence, then a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. "Medic Morgan," Marcus said finally. "I wondered when you'd show up. Sarah said you would come." "Marcus, I found Emma. I found her in the river, just like you planned. She's safe now, and she's with her grandmother." "Did you give her the message?" Marcus asked urgently. "Did you tell her about her daddy?" "I'm working on it, Marcus. But I need your help. I need you to tell me about Jackson Reeves." Emma remembers seeing his dog tags. Another long silence, then Marcus's voice, clearer now, but filled with desperate sadness. "Jackson doesn't know. He never knew about Emma. Sarah made me promise not to tell him. She said it would ruin his career, that the Army doesn't like soldiers who get involved with civilian contractors. Lee felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Sarah Rodriguez had been involved with Jackson Reeves. A relationship that would have violated military regulations and potentially ended both their careers. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant, she had chosen to keep the baby's existence secret rather than destroy BS. Jackson's future. Marcus, where is Jackson now? Do you know how to reach him? He's still Army, Marcus replied, his voice growing agitated. Colonel Jackson Reeves, stationed at Fort Bragg. But Sarah made me swear, Leah. She made me swear I wouldn't tell him until after the war, until he was safe and could choose for himself whether he wanted to be a father. The war's been over for years, Marcus. Sarah's been dead for 10 years. Don't you think Jackson deserves to know he has a daughter? Sarah's not dead. Marcus shouted suddenly, and Lee could hear him moving around the room, his voice becoming more distant as if he was pacing. She's waiting for me. She told me yesterday that she's tired of waiting, that it's time to bring Emma home. Detective Morrison shook his head grimly and pointed to his temple, indicating that Marcus was clearly experiencing hallucinations. But Lee understood the psychology at work here. Marcus's damaged mind had constructed an elaborate fantasy where Sarah was still alive, where his mission had meaning beyond the grave, where the guilt he carried could finally be absolved through this one act of loyalty. Marcus, listen to me, Lee said, keeping her voice calm and professional. Sarah Rodriguez died in my arms 10 years ago in that bombed-out building in Kandahar province. You were there. You remember the IED blast, the way the ceiling came down, the way she whispered her last words to me. No, Marcus said, but his voice was weakening, the certainty cracking. No, she's here with me. She's been here all along, telling me what to do. What did she tell you to do, Marcus? She said to find Emma and bring her to you. She said you would know how to find Jackson, how to tell him that she kept her promise. But she also said... His voice trailed off, and Lee could hear him breathing heavily. What else did she say, Marcus? She said when the mission was complete, I could come home. She said we could finally rest together. The suicidal ideation was clear now, wrapped in the comforting delusion that death would reunite him with the woman whose memory had become his obsession. Lee realized she had only moments before Marcus acted on what he believed were Sarah's final instructions. Marcus, Sarah wouldn't want you to hurt yourself. You know that. She was a healer, a translator who saved lives by helping us communicate with the local population. She wouldn't want another soldier to die because of her. But I failed her, Marcus sobbed. I was supposed to protect the translators. That was my job, and I failed. The IED was meant for me. Sarah died because I didn't see it in time. There it was, the core of Marcus's guilt, and the driving force behind his psychological breakdown. He blamed himself for Sarah's death, had probably been carrying that burden for 10 years, and had constructed this elaborate mission as a way to finally atone for his perceived failure. Marcus, listen to me very carefully, Lee said, drawing on every skill she'd learned as a combat medic dealing with traumatized soldiers. Sarah's death was not your fault. That IED was hidden by insurgents who wanted to kill Americans. Any Americans. You didn't fail her. You survived, and she would want you to keep surviving. But Emma, Marcus said, desperately. Emma needs to know her father. And she will. I promise you that. But she also needs to know that the man who tried to honor her mother's memory was brave enough to keep living, to keep fighting. Can you do that for Emma? Can you do that? Can you live for her? The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Lee could hear Detective Morrison coordinating with the SWAT team through his radio, preparing for the possibility that negotiation would fail and they would need to breach the room. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice small and broken. I'm so tired, Leah. I've been carrying this for so long. I know, Marcus, but Emma is going to need people in her life who knew her mother, who can tell her stories about Sarah and help her understand where she came from. She's going to need Uncle Marcus. The use of the familial term seemed to reach something in Marcus's damaged psyche. Uncle Marcus, he repeated slowly. Sarah used to joke about that. She said if anything happened to her, You and I would have to look after each other. Then let's honor that promise, Lee said. Let's take care of each other, and let's take care of Emma together. Another long pause. Then the sound of furniture being moved. I'm opening the door, Marcus said. Don't let them hurt me, okay? I just want to sleep. Nobody's going to hurt you, Leah promised. We're going to get you help, get you the treatment you need. The motel room door opened slowly, and Marcus Webb stepped out with his hands raised, looking like a ghost of the soldier Leah remembered. The scars on his left cheek were more pronounced than she remembered, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had been fighting an internal war for far too long. As the officers took him into custody with gentle professionalism, Marcus looked directly at Lee. Find Jackson, he said. Tell him Sarah loved him. Tell him Emma has his eyes. 3 days later, Lee found herself standing outside the main gate of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 3 years. The medals on her chest felt heavier than she remembered, particularly the Purple Heart that she had earned in the same blast that had killed Sarah Rodriguez. Agent Castillo had helped cut through the military bureaucracy, and Colonel Jackson Reeves had agreed to meet with her, though he had no idea why a medic from his old unit wanted to see him. The Army had listed the meeting as a debriefing related to the recent incident involving a former soldier and a missing child, which was technically accurate if not complete. Jackson Reeves was exactly as Lee remembered him, tall and lean with prematurely gray hair and the kind of steady demeanor that made him natural leadership material. He had been promoted twice since their deployment together, and his uniform displayed the ribbons and insignia of a distinguished career that was likely headed for even higher ranks. They met in a small conference room in the base headquarters, and Jackson's expression was politely curious as Lee sat down across from him. She had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times during the flight from Portland, but now that the moment had arrived, every word seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Colonel Reeves, she began formally. Thank you for agreeing to see me. Of course, Sergeant Morgan. Though I have to admit, I'm curious about why you wanted to meet. The briefing memo was rather vague. Lee took a deep breath and reached into her briefcase, pulling out the manila folder that contained Emma's photograph, the note from the crate, and the documentation Agent Castillo had helped her gather. Sir, I need to tell you about Sarah Rodriguez. Jackson's expression didn't change immediately, but Lee saw something flicker in his eyes at the mention of Sarah's name. The translator who was killed in the IED blast. I remember her. Tragic loss. She was more than just a translator, wasn't she, sir? For a long moment, Jackson studied Lee's face, perhaps trying to determine how much she knew or suspected. Finally, his military composure cracked slightly, and she saw the grief he had been carrying for 10 years. Sarah was... He paused, choosing his words carefully. She was important to me. We had developed a relationship that was inappropriate, given our respective positions. When she died, I blamed myself for not being there to protect her. She was wearing your dog tags when she died, Leah said gently. Jackson's hand instinctively went to his chest, where his current tags hung beneath his uniform shirt. I gave them to her the week before the blast. She said she wanted something of mine to keep her safe. I got replacement tags before anyone noticed. His voice grew quieter. I never told anyone about us. It would have destroyed both our careers. Colonel, Sarah was pregnant when she died. The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. His face went white, and for a moment, Leah thought he might collapse. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Pregnant? But she never... How do you know this? Leah opened the folder and slid Emma's photograph across the table. Because your daughter survived. Her name is Emma Rodriguez. She's 7 years old, and she has your eyes. Jackson stared at the photograph with the expression of a man whose entire world had just been redesigned around him. Emma's dark hair and serious expression were clearly inherited from her mother, but the shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw, and something indefinable about her bearing were unmistakably his own features, reflected in miniature. My daughter, he said finally, the words seeming to stick in his throat. Sarah never told me. Why didn't she tell me? Because she loved you, Leah replied. She knew that a relationship with a civilian contractor could end your career. She chose to protect your future rather than burden you with a choice between love and duty. Jackson's hands shook, as he picked up the photograph, studying every detail of Emma's face as if trying to memorize it. "Where is she? Is she safe? How did you find her?" Over the next hour, Lee told him the entire story, from finding Emma in the river, to Marcus Webb's psychological breakdown, to the grandmother who had been raising Emma in Portland. She watched Jackson's face cycle through disbelief, grief, anger, and finally a fierce protectiveness that she recognized as the instinct of a father discovering his child. "I want to see her," Jackson said when Leah finished. "I want to meet my daughter." "She wants to meet you too," Lee replied. "But Jackson, you need to understand that Emma has been through trauma. She was kidnapped, put in a crate, and floated down a river by a man who thought he was doing the right thing. She's going to need patience and understanding." "What does she know about me?" "She knows her mother loved you. She knows you're a soldier like Sarah pretended to be. And she knows that Sarah kept her promise to wait for you, even though she never got the chance to tell you about Emma herself." Jackson nodded, his military training helping him process the emotional overload and focus on the practical steps that needed to be taken. "What's her legal status? Who has custody?" "Her grandmother has temporary custody, but she's elderly and has been struggling to care for Emma alone. Child Protective Services is involved, and there will need to be paternity tests and legal proceedings before you can claim parental rights." "I'll start the process immediately," Jackson said. "I'll take emergency leave and fly to Portland tomorrow." Lee smiled, seeing the same determination in Jackson's eyes that she remembered from their deployment. When he committed to something, he followed through completely. Emma was going to have a father who would move heaven and earth to make up for the 7 years he had missed. "There's one more thing," Lee said, pulling out the folded note from the crate. "This is the message Sarah wanted me to deliver." Jackson read the note silently, his lips moving slightly as he absorbed the words that had traveled 10 years and thousands of miles to reach him. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She kept her promise," he said softly. "She waited. She never forgot you, Jackson. And now Emma has a chance to know her father." 2 weeks later, Lee stood in the Portland airport holding a sign with Colonel Jackson Reeves' name on it, though she had no trouble recognizing him as he walked through the arrival gate. He was in civilian clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt that made him look younger and less intimidating than his uniform suggested, but his military bearing was unmistakable. "Lee," he said, extending his hand in greeting. "Thank you for everything you've done." "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "I'm just glad I could finally deliver Sarah's message." The drive to Maria Santos' house was filled with nervous energy as Jackson peppered her with questions about Emma's personality, her interests, her health, her education. He had clearly spent the 2 weeks since their meeting learning everything he could about child psychology and single parenting, approaching fatherhood with the same methodical preparation he brought to military operations. "She's shy," Lee warned, as they pulled into the driveway of the modest house where Emma had been living. "And she's been through a lot. Don't expect her to run into your arms immediately." Jackson nodded, but she could see the anticipation and nervousness warring in his expression. This was a man who had led soldiers into combat, who had made life-and-death decisions under fire. But the prospect of meeting his 7-year-old daughter had him more nervous than any enemy engagement. Maria Santos answered the door with Emma pressed close to her side, the little girl peering around her grandmother's skirts with curious eyes. When she saw Leah, Emma's face brightened with a smile that transformed her solemn features. "Leah!" she called, breaking away from her grandmother to run into Lee's arms. "Did you find him? Did you find my daddy?" "I did, sweetheart," Lee said, hugging Emma close before gently turning her to face Jackson. "Emma, I'd like you to meet someone very special. This is Jackson Reeves. He's your father." Emma studied Jackson with the same intense scrutiny she had shown everyone else, taking in his features and comparing them to whatever mental image she had constructed from her mother's stories and the photographs Marcus had shown her. Jackson knelt down to bring himself to her eye level, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Hello, Emma," he said softly. "I've been looking forward to meeting you for a very long time." "You have my eyes," Emma observed matter-of-factly. "Mama said I got my eyes from my daddy." Jackson's voice was thick with emotion when he replied, "And you have your mama's beautiful smile." For a moment, father and daughter simply looked at each other. 7 years of separation and longing compressed into a single moment of recognition and connection. Then Emma stepped forward and, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to life's surprises, wrapped her small arms around Jackson's neck. "I waited for you," she whispered, echoing her mother's message. "Mama said you would come when you were ready." Jackson held his daughter close, his own eyes bright with tears as he finally understood the full weight of Sarah's sacrifice. She had given up her chance at happiness to protect his career, had raised their daughter alone, to spare him the burden of choosing between duty and family, and had somehow arranged for Emma to find her way to him when the time was right. Over the following days, Lee watched from a respectful distance as Jackson and Emma began the delicate process of building a father-daughter relationship. Jackson had taken extended leave from the Army and was staying in a hotel near Maria Santos' house, spending his days getting to know Emma and his evenings working with lawyers to establish his parental rights. Emma, for her part, approached her newfound father with the cautious optimism of a child who had learned not to expect too much from the adults in her life. She tested his patience with typical 7-year-old behavior, observed his reactions to determine whether he would stay or leave like so many other people had, and gradually began to trust that this tall, quiet man who looked like her might actually be permanent. Jackson handled it all with the patience of someone who understood that trust had to be earned, not demanded. He read her bedtime stories, helped with homework, played endless games of hopscotch in Maria Santos' backyard, and answered her questions about her mother with the careful honesty of someone who wanted Emma to understand that Sarah Rodriguez had been extraordinary. Marcus Webb was receiving treatment in a VA hospital in Portland, his legal troubles resolved through plea agreements that recognized his service record and psychological condition. Lee visited him regularly, bringing updates about Emma and Jackson's progress, watching as Marcus slowly began to separate fantasy from reality with the help of medication and therapy. "She's going to be okay," Leah told him during one visit. "Emma's going to have the family Sarah wanted her to have." Marcus nodded, looking clearer and more present than he had since his capture at the motel. "Sarah would be proud of you, you know. You kept the promise she couldn't keep herself." "We all kept the promise," Lee corrected. "You, me, even Emma. We all did what Sarah needed us to do." On Emma's 8th birthday, 3 months after that morning by the river, Lee found herself standing in Maria Santos' backyard, watching a little girl blow out candles on a cake, while surrounded by the people who loved her. Jackson was there, of course, having officially gained custody and made arrangements to transfer to a base closer to Portland so Emma could maintain her relationship with her grandmother. Agent Castillo had come by with a birthday present, having developed a soft spot for the brave little girl whose case had reminded her why she loved her job. Even Marcus Webb was there, on supervised release from the hospital, looking healthier than he had in years, as he watched Emma open presents with the delighted squeals of a child who was finally, truly safe. As the party wound down and the adults began cleaning up, Emma approached Leah with a drawing she had made during art therapy at school. It showed 4 figures standing by a river: a woman with a dog, a man with scars on his face, another man in uniform, and a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes. "That's us," Emma explained. "That's our family. The lady at school said I should draw my family, and this is it." Lee felt her throat tighten as she studied the drawing. Emma had included everyone who had played a role in bringing her home. The woman who found her, the man who risked everything to deliver her mother's message, the father who had never stopped loving her mother, and herself, the little girl who had carried hope through the darkest of circumstances. "It's perfect, sweetheart," Lee said, kneeling down to hug Emma. "Can I keep it?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Mama would like that we're all together now. She told me so in a dream." Later that evening, after the party guests had gone home and Emma was tucked into bed with Jackson reading her a bedtime story, Lee stood alone by the Clearwater River where this entire journey had begun. Max sat beside her, his graying muzzle resting on her knee, as they watched the water flow past in the gathering dusk. She thought about Sarah Rodriguez, the young translator who had died in her arms 10 years ago, and wondered if somehow, somewhere, Sarah knew that her message had finally been delivered. Emma would grow up knowing she was loved, knowing her father was a hero who had served his country with honor, and knowing her mother had been brave enough to sacrifice her own happiness to protect the people she cared about. The mysteries had been solved, the promises kept, and the family reunited across the barriers of time and death and military protocol. Emma Rodriguez-Reeves had a father who adored her, a grandmother who cherished her, and an extended family of veterans who would always watch over her. But perhaps most importantly, she had her mother's message, delivered at last. That love endures beyond death, that promises matter even when they seem impossible to keep, and that sometimes the most powerful acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet decisions we make to protect the cause. People we love. As Lee turned to walk back to her truck, Max trotting beside her, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For 10 years, she had lived with the regret of an undelivered message, the guilt of a promise she couldn't keep to a dying woman. Now, finally, she could lay that burden down. Sarah Rodriguez could rest in peace. Her daughter was home, her message delivered, and her love story complete. And in a small town in Oregon, a retired Army medic and her faithful dog could go back to their quiet walks by the river, knowing that sometimes miracles do happen and that the bonds forged in war can heal hearts across decades of silence. Emma Rodriguez-Reeves would grow up strong and loved, carrying her mother's courage and her father's determination into a future bright with possibility. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, in a place where brave men and women had once served together, Sarah Rodriguez's spirit could finally find peace, knowing that her greatest mission, the protection of her daughter's future, had been accomplished at last. The river flowed on, carrying its secrets and its stories toward the sea, while overhead, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to the completion of a promise that had traveled further than anyone could have imagined, from a bombed-out building in Afghanistan to a hospital room in Oregon, from a dying woman's whispered words to a little girl's trusting smile. In the end, love had found a way, as it always does, to bridge the gap between loss and hope, between the fallen and the living, between a mother's sacrifice and a daughter's dreams. Emma was home, Jackson had his daughter, and Leah Morgan could finally sleep without nightmares, knowing that some promises are worth waiting 10 years to keep.